I literally just found out that Rob Cosman lives right up the street from me. And if you don't know who Rob is, I'll put a link to all his stuff down in the description. You should definitely go check him out. I've been following him for longer than I've posted videos for, but the funny thing is I had no idea he lived right here in my hometown. So I'm pretty excited to head up to his shop and see if we can't do a video together. All right, so we finally made it up to Rob's shop here. Thanks for having me, Rob. One thing Rob's really good at is cutting hand-cut dovetails, so I thought maybe it would be a good opportunity maybe for him to show us a few tips and tricks on that.
Well, we have to say hello first.
Hey, how's it going?
Imagine we live in the same small town. All right, through dovetail. We can go through this nice and quick. We're going to do a two-tail joint. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the thickness of the pin board, and I'm going to transfer that onto the tail board. Now the tail board we cut all the way around, so we have to scribe the face, the edge, the inside face, and of course the other edge. Then we measure the thickness of the tail board. Easiest way to do it is set your marking gauge on there, let it drop down to the bottom, lock it, and then we'll take that thickness, and that only goes in two places, inside face and outside face of the pin board. Now I've already planed these up, I've labeled them, so the joint's going to go together like that. First thing we're going to do is establish our outside half pin, and the half pin needs to be wide enough to provide good strength and appearance, and yet narrow enough that it won't look clumsy. Now I'm going to just scribe across the end and come up the face, and then I'll spin it around because I'm using a 1:6 ratio. Now how come I can't see that mark anymore? There. Now since this is only going to be a two-tail, it's going to be quite easy. And then the second thing I do is divide that by the number of tails I want. And as I mentioned, since I'm only doing two, it won't be hard. We start on one half pin, and the amount I cross the opposite half pin determines how wide the inside pins are. So make it a little bit bigger than that. Okay, so that's good. So I'm just going to turn around and go from the other side. There's my two marks. Come in here with my 1:6 angle. Square my line across the end, come up the face, flip it around and do the same thing on the other side. Now, don't want to cut off the wrong parts, so we always identify the waist. Okay, now put that in the vise. I always keep it low in the vise so that it doesn't vibrate when you're sawing. I want to make sure that it's standing plumb. That's the standard I always work to. Now I'm going to take my dovetail saw, and the only thing here that's critical is the cuts across the end have to be perpendicular. So you line your saw up with the mark, and saw until you hit that baseline, and turn and go the other way. Now, I didn't do it, but I like to put a rabbet on the inside edge. This is a Lee Nielsen product. The fence is an auxiliary piece that I put on myself. You want the blade to be parallel to the sole, and I have it projecting so it's just beyond the edge of the plane. Line it up, line the plane up, and adjust the fence so that the point of that blade is right on that scribe line. And you can see why you always do this before you actually lay out and start cutting the joint, because when you're cutting across the grain, there's often a tendency for the fibers to roll like that. But I think we can get away with it today. Now, next thing I'm going to do is take my pin board, put it in the vise, and I'm going to get it flush with the top of the plane. And this just works as a prop. Now, that little rabbet I cut is used to line the two pieces up like that. But what we've got to do next is we've got to measure the thickness of my saw kerf. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my plane, I'll grab another marking gauge, set my plane on a hard surface, set the marking gauge on there. I like to drop it down until I hear it hit. Maybe that's the reason why I prefer to use the side of my plane. Now, the blade is sticking out just the thickness of the saw kerf, which is the saw plate plus the set on both sides. And I'm going to set that so that the cutter is on the top. I'm going to move the the board over until it touches. So I now have offset my tail board from my pin board by the thickness of 1 saw kerf. I'm going to take my sawtooth blade, it's in my dovetail marking knife, and since I offset to the right, I'm going to go to the, I offset to the left, I'm going to go to the right side of each tail. I'm going to reach down and then drag that sawtooth blade through the kerf, through the end of the pin board. I'll go to the next one and do the exact same thing. Always easier to make 2 or 3 light cuts and try to do it in one heavy one. Now I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to offset to the right. So what I'm going to do this time is put the cutter on the bottom side, move it over until it touches, the cutter touches the side of the pin board. Now I've offset the tail board to the right by the thickness of 1 saw kerf. So I'm going to go to the left side of each tail, and I'm going to put the sawtooth blade in the kerf. You'll notice I haven't removed the waste yet. That controls where the saw blade goes. Keeps it precise. Okay, now I've got 4 saw kerfs there. I'll set this aside and deal with it in a minute. I'm going to take my dovetail marker and my pen, and I'm just going to draw some lines from the gauge line up to those marks I just made. Now, I want to go right down to this gauge line, setting the saw in the mark that I made with the sawtooth blade. Means it's precisely where it needs to be, and the only thing left to for me to do is to follow that plumb mark. Now just eyeball those real quick and make sure they're okay. They are. So now I'm going to take my fret saw, drop it down to the bottom, and then just zip right across that line. Remove that waste. Now, the closer you can cut to that, or saw to that line, the less material you have to remove with the chisel. And I was off quite a bit, so I've got a fair bit of work to do. While I've got the fret saw in hand, I'm going to go back over here and finish this one. Now, when it comes to cutting the piece out for the half pin, you can take your chisel, come in here and just cut a little V on the side of the waist, so that when I set my saw down, I've got a shoulder to work up against, and it makes at least the start of the cut is precise. And once again, what you're left having to do is make a plumb cut. Same thing on this side. Set that saw. Careful not to nail the side of the tail. You don't want a big saw kerf there. Now I've got to remove my waste. Get a sacrificial block. Now that angle on there on that chisel is about 20 degrees, so it'll slice through the soft pine without crushing it. Set the chisel right in the gauge line. Go down about halfway. You want to make sure the chisel is standing plumb or slightly undercut. Don't go crazy on your angle. If you undercut it too much, you'll run into problems. And the reason you work front to back, if you were to blow something out, at least it's going to be on the inside as opposed on the show side. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a little chamfer down the inside edge of each tail, and I start about a 16th of a way in from the end. If you did the whole edge, you'd end up with little triangular holes in your finished joint. Now what this is for primarily is to assist with the glue, so that the glue doesn't end up being shoved off. It also helps get the joint together. Now sometimes there's a little bit of wood right in that angled area that you have to remove with a chisel. Starting on the inside of the pin board, I'm going to set my chisel right in the gauge line, go down about halfway. And if you've got a really good marking gauge, I send mine out extremely sharp, because a really good marking gauge will leave a line that will, your chisel will, you can actually hear it if I could shut up for a second. Hear that? chisel registers in there, and then there's no guesswork. You know where it's going to go. Now I've got too much material here, so what I'm going to do is come in, do a little preliminary chop first. What that does is eliminate some of the waste, so it's not building up a lot of pressure on the bevel side of the chisel, which would have a tendency to drive it back beyond your gauge line, and that'll leave a mark. Do it here too. Now you also notice that one of the things I like to do is angle the chisel to follow the slope of the pin. So I'm not angling it this way. What I was doing, I was angling it this way. So I ride down the slope of the pin. Can eliminate a whole lot of work in this step. I didn't quite get it, so there's a little bit of material to remove there. Not much there. Want to make sure there's no bumps. It's the whole idea behind having a slight undercutting slope. You see how nice and clean in this case, this chisel is actually ground at 17 degrees. And it just does such a good job on soft woods like alder, aspen, pine, even poplar sometimes. Now, next step is to glue it together. Now, we glue all of the mating long grain surfaces. So I'm not going to put any down there in the bottom. That's end grain. Really doesn't have much value in gluing. Now I just said that, and yet I'm going to turn around and put a little bit on this end grain surface on these outside shoulders. And I do that because my mentor Alan Peters always did, so I guess I did it without questioning. Now put that in position. Tap it home. This is where the block comes in handy because you can put the entire joint together at once. Now, the next thing we need to do is check it to make sure that it's square. Put a square on the inside, and if it isn't, you've got to make that adjustment now while it's still pliable. And put that in the vise. Set the blade. And we're just plane until we get rid of, in this case, the pen marks. I usually don't like to leave a gauge line. I'm in the habit of making heavy gauge lines just because when you're in teaching mode, you want them to be able to see what you're talking about. But normally on a piece of furniture, I make a very, very light gauge line so that you're not having to deal with it after the fact. Dress your blade properly when you sharpen and you don't end up having any overlap marks or what we call plane tracks. And then we'll do a quick flush up on the edge. Now, this is the advantage of that little trick I showed you with the chisel, where you cut a little trough. Because if this is a drawer, as soon as you open it, if there's a gap there, you're going to see it. But you want a nice tight shoulder like that. And that's your... How long did that take us?
That was impressive. I just did a couple dovetails in my last video, and I think each dovetail probably took me roughly an hour. And you just banged that out in like 10 minutes.
Well, I would just have to cut your pay down to about 50 cents an hour.
Yeah. That's pretty awesome. You get a close up of that. So lots of good tips in there. Really appreciate you showing me that, Rob. That's awesome. So don't forget to go over and check out Rob's YouTube channel. All the links will be in the description below. Also check out his website. So thanks a lot, guys.
See ya.